something a bit more controversial in the pro-life aspect is the approach towards women who have gone through abortions. I've seen this, it's sort of split in the community about how to approach women like that. And I think it goes towards that age-old debate trying to reconcile God's mercy and justice. How should traditional Catholics, what should our attitude be towards women who have gone through with abortions? What should the traditional Catholic attitude towards that be, to not be, a negative, judgmental person, in the sense that we're sending the person away as if they can never convert, but also reconciling that with there is a need for justice. How do you reconcile that? How would you suggest people view that circumstance?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different topics at hand. There's the pastoral side and there's the legal side. And pastorally, I take probably a little bit more progressive. I would say it's an anti-traditional view, but I definitely err on the side of mercy for women who've had abortions, partly because it's fully industrialized in a way that it wasn't when, say, St. Alphonsus Liguori was writing about it or the early church was. I don't want to imply there's reduced culpability, but we're in a time right now where, you know, millions and millions of babies are constantly dying. And let's be honest, the oral contraceptive also causes tons of abortions. So it's an entire machine that women are up against. Often they're pressured by their husbands sometimes, but sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the fathers are begging to have the baby live and the woman goes through with the abortion. So I'm not pushing for reduced culpability, but I think in a time when there's something like a third of American women have had abortions, probably double that for chemical abortions. When you look at the oral contraceptive, we can't automatically, as traditionalists, just say, well, they should all go to prison for killing their babies, because we would have, somewhere like Russia in the 1980s, your average woman in Russia, I think, had 2 abortions. That was the average, was 2 abortions. So you simply can't put 90% of the female population in prison in a place like that. So we're up against an entire abortion machine. So as a priest, I simply put the emphasis on confession, that Jesus can forgive this sin. You have to go to confession. And I can't talk about my experience in the confessional, but I can tell you, in seminary, I actually asked a priest who was pretty conservative what would be a good penance. And he said something interesting. He said, send them to an orphanage to work for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, so that you're actually connecting the fact that they have a dead baby to the fact that there are millions of kids living in orphanages right now. St. Alphonsus Liguori talks about giving a suggested penance and a mandatory penance. So you can always give a mandatory penance, but then say, I highly, highly, highly suggest you do this. And I think for a woman's heart to experience reparation, not that it's all about experience, because the main goal of atonement is to make reparation to God's justice. But I think anytime any of us sin, whether it's big sins or small sins, we have a need to make reparation, to make atonement. And so whether it's the mandatory penance or the suggested one, I think this idea of, helping in orphanages or helping the trafficked or working in a crisis pregnancy center or something like that, obviously no one can earn God's love or make up for a dead body. That's only the blood of Jesus can make up for murdering somebody, but we can make reparation for our sins. And I think that's maybe a topic to be had, but I think that's probably better for the woman herself to decide, how intensely am I going to enter into reparation for this? Because if a priest gives something like, you have to work in an orphanage for 10 years as a mandatory penance, what if he hasn't been clear? Is that 2 days a week? Is it 5 days a week? Is it 40 hours a week? So I'm in favor, if I were to teach seminary, I can't obviously talk about my own experience in the confession, but if I were to teach seminary, I would say, give an adequate penance, but then highly suggest a heavier optional penance, so that women and also men, because for every abortion there's also a man behind it, can make adequate atonement for essentially a murder.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure even from a psychological standpoint that provides a lot of healing for the individual as well, just because, as you mentioned, we're sort of made to want to give that reparation to God.